Black Basin Outdoors' Nathaniel Boos on what ammo market data says about the impact of tariffs so far. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over, sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America from a sober, serious perspective that focuses on hard news analysis and reporting. This week, we are going to be talking about some of the real-world signs that we're seeing in the market for how the tariffs are impacting, especially ammo prices, and or aren't impacting them. We're starting to get some actual real-world data on this, and to discuss that, I have with me Nathaniel Boos from Black Basin Outdoors. He's the Chief Marketing Officer. Welcome to the show, Nathaniel.
Stephen, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Now, one of the reasons I reached out to you guys and wanted to have you on the show was that when I went around looking for resources on real world data on ammo prices, there's a lot of places, a lot of good resources for where you can buy ammunition online. Lucky Gunner is a company that we've interviewed them before. There's ammo.com. There's all kinds of places out there, but the only one I saw doing like a hard data analysis of ammo prices, and this is not a new thing. You guys have been doing this for years, was Black Basin. And so I wanted to see what you guys are seeing and how things are going. But, before we get into it, can you just tell people a little bit more about yourself and what Black Basin is? Yeah,
absolutely. So Black Basin Outdoors, we are an e-commerce company through and through. We do not have a retail shop. I'm one of the co-founders. Andrew No is my co-founder, and we've got several partners now that have run companies in the $1 billion range. And we're really taking a e-commerce approach to running this business, and we want to give people informed decisions or tools to make informed decisions on their purchases. Part of that is the pricing data that we offer on Black Basin Outdoors. Primarily, right now, we offer just ammo for the most part. That's 99% of what's on our site. Right now, it's that's something we've really been drilling into to make sure we can give people good pricing. But over the next 2 quarters in 2025, to quarter 3 and quarter 4, we're going to be really expanding our catalog to pretty much everything in the outdoor space: hunting, shooting, fishing, you name it. We'll have it on the site. Ultimately, to be a full-fledged outdoor store is our goal.
Okay, great. And, one of the things that I think sets you guys apart and made me interested in wanting you to come on here and give us a little bit of real world, insight into the market is the way that you track these ammo prices. And it's very granular. You do it, you've been doing it over time. And I think you do it in a way that is much more dispassionate and professional is kind of the vibe that I've gotten from reading your reports on, ammo pricing throughout the different caliber ranges. And, you guys are upfront about how, what's influencing prices, what maybe isn't, that sort of thing. And that's what impressed me about your operation. So can you just give us a little bit of background on how do you guys track ammunition pricing? Obviously you're a buyer and a distributor, wholesaler Sure. of it, but
Correct.
What tools are you using? How, why is it something that people can rely on, even if they're not going to buy from you guys directly?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And first and foremost, our purpose with those ammo prices is to provide the raw data in a way that's easy for people to understand. And primarily, we draw that data from aggregators such as AmmoSeek and WikiArms and a few others that we are listed on, but mainly it's just, every one that offers ammo online is listed there. And typically speaking, the cheapest ammo that you're going to find is online. And so one thing that's really important in the ammo space is making sure that we can provide data that is, when you look at, say, hey, the price of 5.56 was 40 cents around, is that 40 cents a round, including shipping or anything else that I may, credit card fees, whatever that is. And that's something we've done a really good job of making sure that that price that's displayed there is the price that the customer's paying, unless they opt for an add-on or something along those lines. But in generally terms, to get that ammo to their door, that's what they're paying. So we aggregate that data across all of these different shopping engines. We break it down, make sure that we strip out, some factory seconds and it's primarily new ammo that's not reloaded or steel case. It's brass new ammo. The exception of that being like 7.6239. We include steel case in there, but we look at, all right, what is the majority of the market actually looking for here in terms of they want to look at what is the cheapest new 9mm that I can buy that's brass case. That's the number that we try to display on our site. Right.
Absolutely. And so what are you seeing so far? Because, one thing, just as an example, I went and looked at the 9mm pricing chart, which you have a great chart that follows over time that goes back to, just before the pandemic and follows through today. And, what I see in that chart is not much, right? Not much of a change in the most popular self-defense caliber to this point, right? There's a lot of speculation. We had Larry Keane from the National Shooting Sports Foundation, the industry's trade group, on a couple of weeks ago. And he said, tariffs are very likely going to raise prices and impact the gun industry in that way, even though the industry tends to have a very strong American manufacturing component for there's a number of different reasons why it may still raise prices, but it doesn't seem like we've, for 9mm at least, that we're seeing that impact quite yet. I mean, am I being too general there? Or because, prices for 9mm, if you look at that chart, they were 45 cents a round back during the pandemic, the shortage days that everyone, I think, in the kind of gun owning community can remember. And now they're all the way back down to 20 some cents a round. Is that right?
That's correct. And, there's a couple things that are influencing that right now. One of the key factors to kind of consider here is there was a lot of ammo on the market prior to the tariffs being, we were in a slow season. After the election, most ammo businesses online took a 40% hit pretty much overnight after Trump got elected, which most people think it would go the opposite direction. That's just not true. Most ammo purchasing happens out of either scarcity or people being scared. And obviously those are two different things, but when a Republican gets into office, they typically, drive the sales down because people aren't scared that their rights are going to be taken away. They don't need to stockpile ammo for whatever reason. So
right, the so-called Trump slump, right? That was an effect we saw in the first administration.
Exactly.
And something you can also see perhaps in the NICS check numbers, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System numbers, which are sort of probably the best analog we have for gun sales in particular. But you guys have even more finite data on ammo sales, and that's the effect.
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly correct. It's when it's just supply and demand. When there's excess supply and the demand is low, it drives prices down, and people take thinner margins, or they're willing to lose money just to get out of paying interest on that product or going over their terms with these distributors or the manufacturers for that matter. So between that, we are going into the summer season. We're seeing a couple things happen. Is there's an excess of ammo on the market because of the slowdown, and additional to that, we have some manufacturers, especially in the U.S., that are actually taking an opposite approach of with these tariffs, where you would think that since there's a 10% increase on imported ammo, that they would also raise their prices 10% to kind of match that or stay as the more premium brand in the U.S. They're actually taking the exact opposite approach of that and discounting their ammo even further to gain back market share. And that's been very effective in terms of, the amount of brands, domestic made brands of 9mm that we've seen move through our stores, both wholesale and at retail, versus the imported stuff. Now, all of that to say, with the summer coming up as well, we're kind of going into that summer season, which slows down even further in addition to the election results that happened.
Right, because sales are seasonal.
Exactly. Right. Q4, the fall and the spring are our best times for the gun industry, because hunting season, people want to go outside and shoot. No one wants to shoot when it's 100 degrees outside. I'm here in Texas. I can tell you, I don't shoot at all in the summer. It's just too hot. But, so a combination of those things is people still need sales. And so they're driving the price down. They're willing to take a smaller margin. So that's part of the reason. All of those things combined is kind of the reason why we haven't seen really anything move off that mark. And we're kind of almost at a bottom. Now, with that said, eventually what we're seeing on the import side is those people have stopped shipping 9mm 223, some of these primary calibers that were keeping the cost down and creating a lot of excess supply. Those are no longer coming into the country. Those have ceased pretty much indefinitely until the tariff situation gets figured out.
So which brands are you talking about there?
So Patriot Sports is a big one that they make really high quality stuff. It's made out of the Czech Republic, I believe. And they have stopped shipping indefinitely. Igman is another one. They've really ceased a lot of their shipments. ZSR, BPS, a lot of these foreign manufacturers that have really dropped off in their shipments. There's brands such as like Magtech and PMC, PPU, some of these other brands that are much more well-known aren't considered an import so much as maybe like Igman is. Those are still continuing to flow in. However, we are seeing a price increase on that. Since we do have a wholesale side of the business that buys directly from these manufacturers, what that allows us to do is have that open line of communication. And they've told us that on our prices, we can expect to see an increase. It's not going to be the full 10% that we're currently facing with some of the other imported brands. They're going to eat some of that margin, but there's only so much they can do and try to still stay profitable. So those products will continue to flow, but those prices are going up. We're seeing roughly around a 5 to 7% increase on those brands. Whereas on the Igmans and the ZSRs and some of these other ones, if we want to import those, it is a 10% increase. But the issue is that the factories have just said, we're not going to send anything until these tariffs are done, or they figured out if they're going to stay or not.
Yeah, because I guess that's part of the issue right now is the kind of haphazard way with the tariffs have been turned on and off, continually over the course of several weeks here. And that sounds like that's having an impact as well on just certainty in the market.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. They're very uncertain as to what's going to happen. And so until they have that and they can promise their customers that, hey, this is the price that they're going to pay. And, they don't want to have to be responsible for, hey, we shipped a container in and we have a customer that bought 10 million rounds at something that was $30 higher because they had to pay the import, and then the import tax the tariff gets taken away. And well, now they're shipping in stuff cheaper, and you've got people that are, underwater on ammo because of a tariff. So to kind of negate that, they've decided to just stop shipping it at all. And one thing to consider is with the tariff, a lot of the import ammunition becomes uncompetitive in the U.S. market, even at where, when you can buy federal at the same price now, which I guess in a way is, the purpose of the tariff is to let people buy domestic made stuff. And it's good to see that the domestic manufacturers are saying, hey, now's our time to shine. And they're taking advantage of that to gain back the U.S. customers' loyalty and their money. Like they want them to shop with them.
Interesting. So what you're seeing right now, especially in these, I guess, higher demand calibers, right? 9mm 223, the more popular stuff, is there's a glut of supply, or there has been a glut of supply. And you are seeing importers either cut off some of that supply altogether or raise their prices. But at the same time, you're seeing American brands drop their prices to try and make up market share. So there's not necessarily a change in the overall price of 9mm. That's why you look at the chart, you don't see a big effect, but there's this other dynamics going on under the surface of that.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. That's basically the state of the union as it stands today. There's a lot of things moving in the background that is impacting why the price hasn't shifted. Now, longer term, the raw materials that these people are using, both the chemicals as well as the powder and some of the, the brass, the lead, some of that does come from outside of the U.S. And eventually those are going to cause even the domestic stuff to go up. We've already been told that from Kinetic Group that, some of the promo pricing that they've been offering on the 9 mil is just not sustainable with the rising cost in the raw materials. And they're like, hey guys, we're going to offer this as long as we can, but at some point this price point is going to go up. And so when that happens, it's unlikely that the import stuff will come back as strong as it did. We'll probably see a little bit come back, but ultimately when that happens, that's when we'll see a price shift up for some of the more high demand calibers such as 9 mil and 223, 308, 45.
Yeah. I mean, from what you're describing, this actually kind of feels like a really ideal market for what the president and his supporters are claiming they want to do. Just because, one, it's a pretty competitive market between the American producers and the foreign producers. That's why there's not a lot of space for the importers to raise prices, unlike a lot of other markets where the most of the manufacturing capacity is captured by foreign manufacturers, at least consumer product market, right? And also this market, it doesn't have a large Chinese component. So the 145% tariff is not really hitting
Correct.
Ammo manufacturers because there just aren't Chinese ammo manufacturers, right? And so the 10% is, you're not seeing a huge increase for consumers, at least not right now, but you are seeing the tariffs shift the dynamics of the market in favor of American producers to a degree that's not like wildly upsetting American consumers yet, at least. So that, I mean, feels in line with what they are hoping to accomplish with this stuff.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's a spot on assessment of, I guess I'll add one caveat to this is for the calibers that don't have a lot of U.S. production, like, for example, 7.6239. There's really only 2 or 3 brands in the world right now that are not from Russia that are being brought into the U.S. One of those is Tela, another one is Sterling, and then you have Bellum. Those are really the 3 big brands, and those are the ones where we're going to see pretty much an immediate impact. We already have thankfully our last order of 7.629 came in like days before the tariffs hit, and we had a really great price on that. But I can tell you, on something like that where we would say, let's say we were paying $400 a case for that ammo, this next shipment is going to be at $447 because of the additional cost of the tariff there. And we know that's happening unless that tariff gets lifted. And come July, our prices are going to go up on that product because we had to pay more. And we can't source that locally. There is no large domestic supply of 7.6239. And there's some other calibers that presents itself with, some of the European made calibers, a lot of what PPU makes, some of the more, niche stuff. We'll see an increase on those as well. Now, some of the main calibers that are heavily produced in the US, I don't think we'll see as much effect on until at least those raw material costs go up, or if there's a large demand a large increase in demand.
Now, is there, for those more specialized calibers where you don't see American production today, is it realistic to expect you will see American production in the future? I mean, it's pretty hard to spin up an ammo manufacturing plant, right?
Yeah, it is. It's very difficult. It requires a lot of monetary investment. But those high quality machines cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, plus the licensing and the technicians and you got to have certain storage for certain components that are rated for explosives, and and also just the raw component costs of, primers and brass, or in this case for 7.6293 steel, that's an entirely different manufacturing process for the extrusion of the steel than it is for brass. I think really the only people in the US that are currently doing steel case 7.6239 is Palmetto Armory, and hats off to them because quite frankly, that's a heck of a process to put into place. And, they're doing it at a somewhat cost effective, price point, but ultimately they're always out of stock, right? And that doesn't help anyone if the product's out of stock. If you can't get it, doesn't matter what the price is. Right. So we're still going to be heavily dependent on those foreign manufacturers, like Tela and Sterling for some of our steel case 7.6239, on PPU for some of like the 6.5 Swede and stuff like that. those items, we are going to see a direct increase on those. And, the more popular ones sooner, the less popular ones later.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting dynamic that you're seeing so far is that, is at least for the very common rounds, the stuff that is readily produced and available from American manufacturers. The markets, consumers aren't seeing a huge disruption in price, at least they maybe in selection, right? I mean, there may be other reasons that you buy imported ammunition beyond just raw cost too. So there is a limiting factor for consumers in that regard, but it seems much less so than in other consumer markets. And you're having this effect of American brands actually reducing their prices to try and gain market share. So the short term, like I said, it's surprisingly effective so far. I guess the real concern here from a consumer perspective and maybe from a retailer perspective as well is what happens down the line when, if you're getting less supply overall, that's very likely that eventually you'll see prices increase. If you're having less competition in the market, fewer suppliers, fewer manufacturers, again, you're likely to see lower quality, higher costs, relatively speaking. Maybe not, a total fall off the cliff on those fronts, but relatively speaking, that's the concern that critics always have of these kinds of approaches, right?
Yeah, correct. It's just a time game at this point of eventually all this is going to catch up with the market. And just because of how the cascade of events that happened and the seasonality that it happened in, that meaning like coming into a summer season where, typically margins compress and prices go down into the summer, that combined with this has kind of leveled things out. Now, when demand goes up and there's not supply to catch up with it, or the supply that is there to catch up with it is at a higher cost, that's when we're going to see prices really significantly rise for some of these more common stuff that, previously would have been substituted or otherwise you would have been buying imported stuff rather than American made. If the import stuff is now higher than the American made stuff, well, that means the whole market's going to go up if the demand out for American made stuff exceeds what's actually available for the supply.
One thing longer at that point, American brands no longer have to lower prices to gain market share, right? They just naturally gain it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's because, one of the biggest driving factors that we see on the retail side of our business that the reason why they buy a certain product is because of price. As long as it's not going to blow up their gun and they go punch holes in paper, ultimately price is the number one driving factor. And so, we do see some of our user base that is loyal to a single brand. And, if we offer an American made brand at a better price or a similar price to what we're offering an imported brand, the US manufacturing will win out every time. The only time we see exceptions to that would be on some of the really, really high quality foreign made stuff. PMC, for an example, it's one of our best selling SKUs and product lines. And quite frankly, a lot of the US made 5.56 and M855 specifically is not high quality. It's pretty dirty. It's, it blows up guns sometimes for that matter. PMC has been extremely consistent. And so when you have something like that, where there's demand for that particular brand on those SKUs, I've seen it already in the last 3 weeks. We went from paying, $3.80 a case on PMC to paying $3.95, and now it's up at 41 cents a round for our cost as a wholesaler to purchase that. And, and that's over the course of 3 weeks. And that's kind of when we saw this pinch happen of, these manufacturers don't, keep a whole lot of supply in the US. It's regular shipments that come in and get distributed out almost immediately. And so that's one of the particular brands that we've saw, like that's today, that's happening right now. And, we're out of the 5.56 green tip right now because, the supply is very limited because they have reduced the amount that's coming in because of the tariffs, but also, the demand is still high for that product and because it is such a good product. And so we'll see on certain products that are very popular or, there's not a good US equivalent for around the same price. those are going to shoot up very quickly. And we've already seen that on that particular one.
So you're already seeing in some cases stock going dry at this point.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, yes, the answer is yes on that question. We have several SKUs that are key SKUs for us that are imported brands that we cannot restock right now. Either because the price is way too high, someone else is trying to make money on it, a broker, but the manufacturers or the importers themselves just don't have any supply available.
That's interesting. I mean, especially because, this market's not even being hit by some of these the larger tariffs, right? We're talking
Exactly.
about 10% tariff on South Korea, right? That's where PMC is made.
Correct.
And that's still having a dramatic effect like this.
It is. And it's a concern for us because not only does that affect our customers' ability to get ammo, but, if that's a certain percentage of our sales every month, then we no longer have that. That's, and we don't have a suitable replacement for it because those people are going to go to someone that has it in stock, or, they're not going to buy an American equivalent of that on those particular products. And we're talking, that may be hundreds of thousands of dollars in sales every month for our business. And that's significant for any business. So when you have that kind of leave the market and there's not something to fill that hole, it's a detriment. And so in ways like that, it actually hurts, some of the US companies and even the brands because, they've built such great brand loyalty that they're not going to switch to a US made brand. They're just going to either pay a higher price or they're going to wait it out until it does come back into stock.
Yeah. And if they pay a higher price, they won't be able to buy as much, right?
Exactly. So it almost works against of what they were trying to accomplish with the tariffs, depending on what the brand is. And, props on PMC for building a great brand in the US, but it's unfortunate that they're being hit so hard with those tariffs. Yeah.
And so are you, I guess that some of the stuff we're seeing in the broader, consumer market outside of firearms is this idea that, there were like the trade deficit ballooned recently because people are trying to get ahead of the tariffs hitting.
Right.
And so you're getting a lot of stockpiling, and Amazon prices haven't changed yet, but people expect they will in a month or two. It seems like that you don't have that same kind of buildup, at least from what you've seen in the ammo market, where you didn't get just a huge influx of PMC to just stored somewhere in America before the tariffs hit. They're just not available now.
Yeah, I mean, typically, to answer your question, yes. We didn't see that happen. And the reason for that is because, these manufacturers will typically, they don't want to have ammo on their floor in their warehouse or wherever they're storing it. Typically speaking, they'll create the order for a customer when it leaves the port in Korea. Is they'll load a container and says, okay, you're getting 4 pallets of this, 4 pallets of this, and 3 pallets of that. And that'll come into the US port and it'll immediately go to that customer. And that customer will sell through that ammo and then they'll get the next container that they have. And so what that leaves us with is when these tariffs get announced practically overnight, that they're the new shipment that's coming in, or any new shipments that would come in, are already going to be at this new higher price, or they're just not going to take the ammo. They don't want the shipment anymore because it's no longer competitive in the market. Right. Now, that's not to say that we didn't have an excess supply in the US already because of the, things dropping out after the election.
Just slower demand.
Yeah. But I mean, there wasn't a time for us to build up a backlog or a back supply of this, cheaper foreign ammo to supply to get us through this term.
Right. Because there wasn't necessarily that expectation. People maybe expected it more with China, right? The tariffs would be put on China. There was a lot of discussion around that beforehand. But I guess people were much less certain about what ended up happening with this sort of just broad-based 10% across the board tariff. And so the market wasn't really prepared for that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I think everyone was caught off guard. We have very open lines of communications with all of our manufacturers that import ammo. And they said this kind of came out of the blue for them. They expected China and maybe, some of these other larger manufacturing companies, but across the board for every country, for the most part, that was almost unheard of. And that overnight pretty much changed the landscape of our market. And in some ways good for some businesses because, in our case specifically, I'll give you an example. We had purchased, pre-election, we had took the gamble that Kamala Harris was going to win. That's what the polls were. I had faith that Donald Trump was maybe going to win. But we thought that the last time he ran, right? And that's not what happened. And so we kind of had made the gamble that we were going to stock up on some of the key SKUs that, maybe not at an optimal price because of the panic that was happening. And, a lot of that was imported ammo. And so we bought that, and, it's selling. It was selling slow after the election, but ultimately, we could have reinvested that money elsewhere to be much more profitable. But the point I'm driving at is, for a while we thought that ammo wasn't going to be profitable anymore. But now with the tariffs in place, that ammo just became much more profitable for us because we do have a back supply of it. So you have some small wins sprinkled in there.
Yeah. Yeah. So you had a stockpile because you were trying to get ahead of potential election results. Right. That didn't go the way expected, but then neither did these tariffs, and just having that stockpile does help in your case because not haven't been able to source some of these SKUs, some of these rounds, right? But you had them already because of this. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about the other area that I would expect? You mentioned this earlier, but another area that you expect disruption from these tariffs, I think, is specialty rounds, right? Like anything that's not widely produced by American brands is just going to be much more expensive or not available at all. What are you seeing with that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. 762 was the example I used earlier, and obviously there's a lot of demand for that, and the throughput is very high. So we'll quickly see the price change on that quicker than we will on something like 762 by 25, right? That's, I believe the old Tokarev pistol load that was in Russia. And really the only people that manufacture that are, I believe Cellular and Bellet does, and PPU is, I think, the primary one that manufactures that. They've got some other, oddball calibers that were used by Eastern European countries or Europe or whoever it was, where it's not standard in the US, but people love to have those guns because they're cool pieces of history, and they still need ammo for them. And there's no domestic manufacturing for it because there's no money to be made in the domestic manufacturing. Whereas, PPU, for example, manufactures that because those rounds are still in service for some of these smaller Eastern European countries, where they still have firearms that shoot those, or they're popular over there, so to speak. And there's a small enough market in the U.S. or large enough market in the U.S., I should say, that it justifies importing it. And so I think we'll continue to see those rounds be available, but they will go up in time. Right now, I don't think we've seen a drastic increase to the price on those, not that I've seen, because the demand is much lower. And, with that, though, one thing to always keep in mind when you're thinking about these more niche calibers is that if a company like, a PSA comes out and says, hey, we're making this historic firearm in the US now, where they're going to sell tens of thousands of these firearms. Well, okay, now this really seemingly oddball and niche caliber is now, has 30 or 40,000 new guns in the US, which may not seem like a lot, but, we're talking a couple million rounds of ammo there, assuming everyone buys 1,000 rounds for that gun. And so that very quickly will change the dynamic of that particular caliber. So, but as a whole, the more niche stuff that's only made outside of the US and doesn't have any domestic production, those calibers will go up in price. I think they'll continue to be available because it makes sense to still bring it in even at a higher price because they have basically the market cornered. It'll just take a little while before we get there.
Right. And I guess you alluded to this as well, and it's in a similar vein, really high-end ammunition, because not everybody is buying purely on price point. Some people like competitive shooters, and anyone who wants match-grade stuff, they may have a much more brand loyalty at that point. What do you expect to happen with that part of the market, the sort of high-end, extreme precision sort of ammunition?
Yeah, so that's actually a great point. I think that there's enough domestic manufacturing for some of those, like higher end calibers of hunting or precision or, subsonic, whatever that looks like, that maybe if previously there was a equally good competitor in the imported space, but now they can go get Hornady, which is domestically made, or Federal Gold Medal Match, or something along those lines. They can get those at an equally good price or even cheaper price now. And yes, it's maybe a little bit more than what they were paying previously, but they're probably getting a higher quality product anyways. And if you're spending $10,000, $5,000 on a gun, the chances of a US made product going wrong in that gun is much lower than something on the import side, just because we have tighter controls on that. I don't see
the American companies tend to dominate the higher end of the ammo market, like the precision match rounds. Yeah,
that's correct. I would say the only caveat to that being like, some of your subsonic stuff, a lot of that was made outside the US, your cellular embellets and your MagTech and your PPU and whoever else. Those were your budget options for that. But a lot of the US manufacturers, even now that they're lowering their prices, are now competitive with what the pre-tariff import cost would have been. So we're not really seeing a whole lot of shift there. And the US market is pretty much dominated by US manufacturers for the higher end precision and hunting round stuff.
Okay. So probably not much impact there. That makes sense.
Not a whole lot. We may see some on, like, for example, cellular and pellet are pretty much dominates the 30-06 and 6.5 Creedmoor in terms of the soft point round. We'll see an increase there, but it won't be enough to take over or to let the U.S. market or the U.S. manufacturers kind of take that control back, because they'll still be cheaper even with the tariff.
Okay. And one other question I had just is about like ownership of these companies, because a lot of these American brands, first of all, there's a lot of ammo brands, but most of them are owned by just a couple of companies, right?
Correct.
And Vista owns a ton of them, and that was just sold to a Czech company, right? But that shouldn't have any impact tariff-wise, because they still make the
correct
the products here. Okay.
Yeah, that's a great point. So there was actually a massive, we call it a roll up in our industry, where one company consolidates, 3 or 4 other, major players or their competitors in their space to form a larger company. The Czech Group, which is a Czech investment government, quasi-government organization in Europe, purchased all the ammo brands from Kinetic Group, or which is what is now Kinetic Group. It was a part of Vista. They sold it and formed the Kinetic Group, which owns Remington, Federal, CCI, Spear, Heavy Shot, and I think one or two more. So a lot of those brands are owned by one company now. And then Fiocchi also just got sold to that brand. So Fiocchi was they do have domestic made stuff as well as European made stuff. And then they had like 2 or 3 other European manufacturers that also got sold to the Czech Group. Those guys were just buying up everyone. So really the only major manufacturers in the US that are not owned by that group is going to be Winchester, which also owns Ammo Inc. They just got purchased. So Winchester is owned by Olin, if you know who they are.
It's a big chemical company.
Yeah, exactly. And they do a lot of the U.S. contracting for, when the government needs ammo or the Army needs ammo. That's generally who's producing at the Lake City plant. I'm sure some of your viewers are very familiar with that. So I doubt that the U.S. will ever let that kind of go. But and then you have Hornady, which is also another big U.S. And you have some smaller ones in here that load, but those are the 2 big ones. And to answer your question in a roundabout way, we should not see any tariffs impact, some of these companies that are now owned by a foreign company. It's only stuff that's coming across the pond.
Okay. All right. Well, because that's a good distinction. Now, I guess one of the things that's kind of hanging over all this is right now it's a 10% tariff, but originally on Liberation Day, as President Trump called it, these were supposed to be much larger tariffs, even on places like South Korea or the EU. And then he pulled back on that, and then kept it at the 10% level that we're seeing now, which sounds like is already disrupting the import market here. what happens in July, technically what he said is that he's putting a 90-day pause on this. And I think it's very difficult to predict exactly what the president is going to do on this stuff. He clearly is committed to the idea of high tariffs, but has gotten a lot of pushback and he paused them. What happens if they come back in July? And I mean, what was the South Korean tariff, for PMC's sake?
I want to say
it was much higher than 10%, right?
I think it was 20%. I don't quote me on that. I have to go back and look at my notes, but I can tell you the most significant one that we saw was Bosnia, which is where Igman ammo is made. And that was 36%. And I mean, that was taking a case of ammo from $400 to like 500 and, I think it was $530, I believe. And
so what would the result of that be if they went back to these higher levels?
Yeah, if it reverts back to that in July, we're just not going to see those brands on the U.S. market. They just won't exist anymore. They won't be competitive. The quality of the product isn't high enough. The brand recognition isn't there. And if they're the only supplier of a certain caliber, then we may see it. Such as 7.6239 or some of these other ones. But for the 223 and 9mm, 5.56 stuff like that, 308. You won't see that brand on the U.S. market if those higher tariffs are in place. And it, just as a general sentiment, the 10% is what's in place right now. And that's kind of what everyone in our space is thinking that's going to stick around, until at least these countries negotiate or figure that out between the politicians. But if we see those 36% tariffs come back for some of these countries, we will not see those brands on the market. So if you have a brand that you like that's currently available that potentially may not exist after that tariff, I'd say stock up on it now. Yeah. I mean, that's probably generally good advice because you just don't know. Right.
Unfortunately, there's no way to, I think, really predict whether I don't know. He backed down once. I don't know that he'll go back and cause this whole, backlash that made him back down the first time. I don't know if he's going to do that again, but
right.
The President Trump is not somebody who's easily predictable in these circumstances. And he does genuinely seem to really like the idea of tariffs. So who knows? But I guess that, it's been an interesting conversation because it's not necessarily what I think anyone would expect coming into it, right? There's, however you fall down on the tariffs, whatever your view of them is, you can, I guess, from our conversation, you can find some good and some bad from an American perspective, at least. Probably all bad from the, if you like imported ammunition or you are somebody selling imported ammunition or making it. But, if you believe in the idea that these will help American manufacturing, it does seem like they're in some sense in the ammo market. It is for now, for the short term. The longer term picture doesn't look as pretty. And I guess one thing like you said, we're going into the summer months, which are that's the doldrums for the gun industry, right? You get the
Correct.
Fewer sales, lower volume. And so I guess we shouldn't necessarily expect, unless the tariffs change dramatically in July, right? But if they stay the same, we shouldn't necessarily expect to see huge shifts in overall pricing on like 9mm or 5.56 until maybe fall when demand starts to pick up again. Is that, and I think supply is not there as much as it was?
I think that's probably a pretty fair assessment. It'll depend. It's hard to say how much excess supply is really out there. I think we'll know, a good thing to keep an eye on is, if you're a listener to this call, is, when you go to AmmoSeek or you go to, your favorite ammo vendor, or you look on their email list, or, what number of products are they promoting, or do they have on their site that's in stock that's domestic made versus foreign made? That's a kind of a good thing, is once you start seeing the bulk of the cheap ammo that is on the market being domestic made stuff, that'll be kind of a good indicator that, hey, prices may be going up very soon, because the imported stuff, which typically dominates the lower tiers or the lower price points, is gone. And once those manufacturers just realize have realized, material costs or raw component costs, whatever that looks like, eventually those will start to creep up. So that's just something to kind of keep an eye on. But I think your assessment of, maybe I think it's going to hold pretty steady throughout the summer, and then kind of after July 4th is when we start seeing things go back up in terms of sales volume and so forth and so on. That's when we'll typically see, probably most of the price increases take effect, which is, what we think is probably going to happen. Most people keep like a 60 to 90 day supply of ammo on hand. And that's kind of where it'll run out, is right around July 4th. And so, that, I think will coincide, and we may see a pretty sharp spike in the fall. It's hard to know. If I had a crystal ball, I'd be a billionaire, but,
right. Certainly.
But yeah, that's my educated guess on what this is going to do. And that's kind of how we're running our business with that in mind. And I'll say that there's a number of other large people out there that probably share that same sentiment.
Well, it makes sense. And, it's maybe it's a good time to stock up then if you're, a consumer. I don't know. Maybe you can get ahead of that price increase right now. And maybe you have a little more time in the ammo market than you do in the like furniture market or toy market, or where some of these other markets that are much more heavily impacted by like Chinese manufacturing, where the tariff is much higher. But still, it does seem like eventually you're going to start to see price effects. Now, I guess one thing seems clear too is that you're not going to see the same price impacts that like the pandemic had, right? Where it doesn't seem likely that 9mm is going to get back to 40+ cents a round, right? Because of this.
No, I mean, likely what we're going to see here is, assuming worst case scenarios, everything goes up by 10%. We go from $210 a case to $225 a case, right? That's reasonable. That's not terrible. That's, I think most people can afford that. I know things are tough and we're kind of sort of in a recession right now, but ultimately, we're not going back to COVID prices, thank God, because, it going up $200 a case is unacceptable, and most people can't afford that, or just will opt to shoot way less. So, worst case scenario here is really it goes up 10%, and we're looking at goes from $220 a case to $200 to $220 a case, or $400 for a case of 223 to $440. So there's going to see some increased cost at some point, but as with everything, prices are always going up.
Yeah. Although this one is more explicitly man-made cause of prices going up here, but therefore, ideological, political, economic philosophy reasons that's happening. And some people think that's for the better. We're not here to decide that question, just here to try and figure out what the market is showing us. And that's why I appreciate you coming on and giving us that kind of insight into what we're seeing already from some of the impacts of these tariffs. Because we do have actual real world signs we can look at instead of just theory. And the outcome, I think, was actually pretty interesting, and maybe not exactly what you'd expect, regardless of what point of view you were coming from to begin with. So I appreciate you doing that. And we will have to have you on again in the future to give us an update on where things are at. But in the meantime, if people want to follow you guys, I know you guys will not only do you have the charts, but you have the market analysis there that gets into some points we were talking about today, and you guys send out updates on this the market outlook pretty regularly to your customers and followers, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So there's a couple of different ways you can reach out to us. Instagram is a good one. We're kind of revamping that slowly, but at Black Basin on Instagram, and then really the best way to get in touch with us or read about any type of market shift or our analysis on anything tariff related or anything ammo related for that matter, or really gun industry, is on our blog at blackbasin.com. We have a fear and greed index on there, which kind of tells us, based on our sales volume, what we're seeing week over week or day over day in terms of, hey, we experience a rush on ammo based on that. And that's just raw data that's being pushed through our system from all of our stores that we own, as well as the wholesale side of, what's happening in the market. It's not something that we're setting. It's just data based. And the same thing with the charts that we have on our site. That's just raw data. We don't have any influence over that. We publish the numbers as they are, good or bad. If we're publishing on something on our site for $500 for a case of 556 and the market's 40 cents around, well, I would say go find the 40 cents around one somewhere, wherever that is.
Right.
We publish that data so people can make informed decisions. Ultimately, we want to provide good prices, but ultimately we want to provide a better service for our customers. Whenever we do see any type of developments in the tariffs or any situation regarding the change in ammo prices, we try to put that out in a newsletter. Right now we've been doing it every other week regarding the tariffs, because there's something that kind of involves there, either information from the governments or information from our suppliers. And we want to provide that to people so they can stay in the loop. They can make, informed decisions, and they're not getting caught off guard by if prices do flip overnight, which is unlikely. But, that's the best way to do it, is get on our email list, go take a look at the Fear and Greed Index, look at the price charts. We track pretty much every caliber. In the very near future, we'll have price tracking on the SKU level. So you'll be able to track the history of PMC 556, this UPC. What is that one done in the last 30 days, the last 60 days, last 90 days?
All right.
We're rolling that out, and hopefully that'll be useful for folks.
Awesome. Well, appreciate you coming on, and we'll have to talk to you guys again in the future on this
Perfect.
stuff. That's all we've got for you guys this week. If you want to head over and sign up for our newsletter, The Reload, you can do that at thereload.com. And of course, if you want to support the reporting we do here, you can buy a membership. That is how we fund our operations. We don't take advertisements or do anything else at this point. It's just all member funded. So, head over, you'll see what you get with the membership, including early access to this podcast and the opportunity to appear on one of our podcasts if you want. So head over to thereload.com and check that stuff out today, and we will see you guys again real soon.